I don't say great. I say very good. I think great is defined by consistency, and obviously you're looking at a coach who's missed the postseason for the last 4 seasons. 3 of those 4 were losing seasons, and 6 out of 7, really, if you go back as far as missing the postseason. So to me, the truly, truly great coaches are the ones that are defined by consistency. It starts with Bill Belichick. Right now, I think Bruce Arians would be the second best coach in the NFL. But Coughlin, obviously, the 2 Super Bowl rings, he's had those kinds of runs in him. So I think when we talk about elite quarterbacks, if you talk about elite coaches, he's not in the Brady, Manning level, but he's at the next level down.
All right, so if we said by the end of the week Tom Coughlin is the next Eagles head coach, did they make a mistake then?
I don't know if it's a mistake because this is an organization that really has to get back. It's been rudderless in the Chip Kelly regime, and it really needs consistency. And generally, when you make coaching changes, you go from one extreme to the other. If you have a player's coach, you go to more of a disciplinarian. And when you look at what Chip Kelly represented, a lot of his people will call it innovation, no matter what you want to call it. It was newness. And I think Tom Coughlin goes back to a more traditionalist mindset. I think if he does get this job, I think it's clearly a Jeffrey Lurie move by himself. I think he would be overruling Howie Roseman and Don Spolansky, but it's a possibility because if you look at what happened today, Coughlin got a personal audience with the Pope himself, Jeffrey Lurie, before the meeting, and that's generally not what happens to most head coaching candidates.
Yeah, and by the way, Tom Coughlin has completed his interview with the Eagles, and now he will interview with the San Francisco 49ers. And, you know, there's been a lot of people that said this was more of a feeling out than an interview. Do you think he is a legitimate candidate for this job?
Well, I do, only because I think Lurie's kind of taken it over. I think he's taking more of a hands-on approach as opposed to what he's done in the past. And, you know, instead of swinging for the fences, maybe he's trying to cut down on his swing and looking for a base hit or a double in the gap and not going for the home run, because we always talk about these young coaches who are going to be the next big thing that can have an Andy Reid-like shelf life. And I still think that's the more likely option here with a Doug Peterson type or somebody like that. But if Lurie, you know, puts his foot down and says, look, we got to get this thing going in the right direction, and if that means having Tom Coughlin for 3 or 4 years and him handing the baton to a hand-picked successor, maybe that could be the proper way to go. What's clear is this team's gun-shy after what happened with Chip Kelly, and there's a lot of hemming and hawing, and they're not sure about how to move forward.
So were they, in your opinion, were they disappointed that Adam Gase signed to be the next head coach in Miami? Was that did that put them back to square one and make them kind of start the process over?
I mean, I don't know if they were disappointed so much as because they were going to pump the brakes. I mean, the fact that they had him in for 8 hours tells you they were interested. But Gaze's timetable wasn't the same as theirs because he had significant interest around the league and other teams lining up for his services. And the Eagles weren't willing to move up their decision-making, and that's what kind of derailed it. I think if he was still waiting, he would certainly be a favorite still in the mix. But the Eagles weren't going to make the same mistake they made with Chip Kelly, in that they would focus in on one candidate at the expense of all others, which is exactly what they did in 2013 until Kelly decided he was going back to college at first. Then they were forced to look at other candidates. This time they didn't want to fall in love with the first girl they saw at the bar, so to speak, and they wanted to see what else was out there. and the fact that the time frame for each side didn't coincide with each other is what sort of derailed that from happening.
That's my 2016 New Year's resolution, too. John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. Paul Guenther, he's coming in for an interview. Do you think what happened with the Bengals this weekend hurts his candidacy at all?
I never thought he was on the more serious side anyway. I don't think he was in the top because I think they're still, if they're going to go away from an offensive coach, to me it would only be like a guy like Coughlin, who brings a lot more to the table. I think Gunther's more of a due diligence guy. He's local, went to Ursinus, so I think that adds into it. But I don't think he's as serious as some of the other candidates. The fact that that defense lost its cool, I think more of that is blamed on Marvin Lewis than Guenther. But certainly it's between all of them. I mean, you have to look at it and say, that team became unhinged at the worst of times. And certainly the two top people to point at are Marvin Lewis and Paul Guenther. So he's got to be blamed for at least some of it. But that's just, sometimes in the NFL we criticize Chip Kelly for doing the exact opposite. You have talented players. Sometimes you have to deal with these quirky personalities. Unfortunately, it blew up on the Bengals at the worst time.
John, Deuce Staley, Pat Shurmur, Adam Gase, who's off the market, Ben McAdoo, Doug Peterson, Tom Coughlin. Gase is out. The other 5 are still available. Is one of those 5 names the next Eagles head coach?
I would think so. I still think it's Doug Peterson, and the fail-safe would be Pat Shurmur would be my 2 favorites at this point. Unless, as I said, Jeffrey Lurie steps in and says, you know what, let's go with Tom Coughlin. And it would be interesting if he did that because obviously the one team Coughlin has struggled with more than any other in recent season is the Eagles. So it would be interesting to bring in a coach that they've had so much success against. But you could certainly sell those 2 Super Bowl rings to this fan base, that's for sure.
Should be interesting to see where Coughlin, if he gets a job. I mean, at this point, he's interviewing with the Eagles, 49ers, and there's some talk that other teams are now interested. So we'll talk more in depth on the Eagles coaching tomorrow when we are live at the Golden Nugget in Atlantic City. Let's talk about a couple of other things. Number 1, Marvin Lewis has said he will be back next year. Have the Bengals made the right decision, or do you think they should maybe elevate one of their coordinators or go a different route after another postseason disappointment for the Bengals?
Well, that's the only way I think they would move on is if they were concerned about losing a guy like Guenther to another team, and they felt he was the long-term answer. I could see that sort of spurring some action. But, I always say history is not fond of context, and if you look at the last 2 seasons specifically, the Bengals' losses against Indianapolis, A.J. Green wasn't playing, Tyler Eifert, Marvin Jones were just crippled by injuries. And then the Pittsburgh game, for all the talk about the lack of poise, and that's true, and the implosion, bottom line is if Andy Dalton's playing that game, it's probably a rather easy Cincinnati win, and it just didn't happen for them. So I think Cincinnati understands they have a good coach, and if you look around the league, Mike, and the fact that Mike Zimmer, what he's doing in Minnesota, Jay Gruden, what he did in Washington, Hugh Jackson's going to get a head coaching job. I believe he'll get the 49ers job, and Guenther is interested. Vance Joseph, their defensive backs coach, is going to be the defensive coordinator for Adam Gase in Miami. That's how well-respected Marvin Lewis is around this league. And I think the Bengals know that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one because you're right. If they were just in a tough spot without having Dalton. But, I mean, it's fair to say that A.J. McCarron wasn't the reason they lost that game?
Well, sure. I mean, he wasn't the reason they lost, but he didn't play well. And I'm saying if Dalton's in that game, it's probably not a one-possession game end, and you probably don't have to worry about players imploding. Obviously, Vontaze Burfict and Pac-Man Jones, Actually, Adam Jones, going back to the Pac-Man days, cost them that football game. So obviously AJ did enough to win, but he clearly didn't play well. And if you saw Andy Dalton for 3/4 of this season, he was in the MVP conversation. I think it would have made a huge difference, and that's some of that context that will get lost when we talk about history and just look at 0-7 and say Marvin Lewis was 0-7 in the first round of the playoffs. And nobody has coached more games in the NFL with one team without winning a playoff game than Marvin Lewis. So that's a stark statistic, and it's tough to get around it. At some point, you got to get it done, no matter the excuses. But there are some legitimate hiccups and reasons why it hasn't happened.
Yeah, John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. So at this point, I kind of agree, and we talked about this a little bit last week. Doug Peterson and Shermer, they seem to be the two safe guys. And then if somebody else emerges, which doesn't look like at this point, that I think Peterson or Shermer is going to be the next head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. And yesterday, Doug Peterson went through the interview process. Why do you think Peterson hasn't been mentioned as a candidate anywhere else?
Well, I think a lot of people look at the situation and that they've realized that Andy Reid is basically the head of that offense, and he hasn't reached the level of some of the other coordinators like Gaze, who's worked with, despite his age, a number of different quarterbacks and had success with each. So I don't think his resume is developed. But, you know, if Andy Reid believes he can be a head coach in this league, and I know Eagles fans don't want to hear this, that carries a lot of cachet around the NFL. Because similar to Marvin Lewis, people have a ton of respect in this league for what Andy Reid has done and has accomplished. Remember, that was his 11th playoff win when the Chiefs shut out the Texans, and that's 8th all time, Mike. So there aren't a lot of coaches in the history of this league that have gone to the playoffs. And when we talk about great coaches and we talk about consistency, like I said, that to me is more important. I always talk about Marv Levy, Buffalo Bills. It's more impressive to go to 4 straight Super Bowls than it is to win one. And I realize most people don't agree with it, but I can tell you in the NFL, everybody agrees with it. And when you have that consistency from year to year, and that's what Andy Reid had so long for here until it went bad at the end, it's what he's developing in Kansas City. People respect his opinion, and he thinks Doug Peterson's going to be a very good head coach. And that's going to carry a lot of weight with Jeffrey Lurie.
All right, John, let's look at the games yesterday, get your opinions on, first off, Minnesota. Walsh misses the 27-yarder, and obviously people blaming him, burying him a lot. He had kicked 3 earlier in the game from much deeper. Laces does it. He boots one right down the middle with Laces facing him. But that kick he missed, I mean, that's not wide left. That is tremendously wide left. What happened with the Vikings yesterday?
Well, yeah, there's another tortured franchise that finds new ways to lose. It was a bad kick. There was a lot to it, though. It was a bad hole, as you mentioned. He became the real-life Ray Finkel. The fact that he was able to kick the football so well with consistently bad holes throughout the game sort of set him up for this. Chris Cluey, his old holder, foreshadowed it on Twitter. He said it's amazing he's making kicks with such poor holds an hour before it happened. That said, you know, it's a 27-yard field goal. If he gets it down in that kind of weather and that kind of cold, you got to kick it through. And to Blair Walsh's credit, he said, hey, if he gets a whole watermelon down there, I got to make that kick as long as the football is down there. So he took responsibility for it before breaking down. Afterwards, he's got to make a lot more to it. And it starts with the fact that the holder in Minnesota, who is Jeff Locke, the punter, is not only not a very good punter, he's not a very good holder. And he hasn't been for 3 years. But Rick Spielman, the general manager, has kept him around because he drafted him, and he doesn't want to admit a mistake. I think finally he now will admit he made a mistake.
And obviously we touched on Cincinnati a little bit, but obviously you got guys like Adam Jones, Vontaze Burfict. They've had history before, and it just looked like a team that just lost complete control in the last 2 minutes of that game, and it just seems like the same old Bengals. They just can't get out of their own way.
Yeah, it does. I think the officials should have called offsetting on the Pac-Man Jones part of it. I certainly have to call Burfict in that situation, in this environment, for a personal foul. But the second one, you have to understand the situation. You have to realize Joey Porter's on the field. He's a very savvy player, and he remains savvy as a coach. He was antagonizing a player. As an official, you have to realize that. And if anything, call offsetting penalties. Let the players decide the football game. And Dean Blandino enters into it too, because he's in the ears of these officials, and he could have said something and made sure they erred on the side of caution. So while I think they made a mistake, still, as the Cincinnati Bengals, as Adam Jones, you can't give the opportunity to the officials to make that mistake. So at the end of the day, Cincinnati imploded. They should have won the football game. They didn't. And it's a very, very difficult loss, obviously, for Marvin Lewis, as we were just talking.
Which way's worse?
Maybe he doesn't.
Which way's worse, Cincinnati's loss or Minnesota?
They're both, and it's interesting because if you think about it, Mike Zimmer was with Cincinnati. So it seems, and the same with Jay Gruden, it seems anybody involved with Marvin Lewis can't win a playoff game. They're two of the worst losses I've ever seen in 2 days, and I saw two grown men crying over losing football games, Adam Jones and Blair Walsh. That's how emotional and gut-wrenching those losses were. It depends on what city. I suppose if you're a Vikings fan, that was the worst loss ever. If you're a Bengals fan, that was the worst loss ever. Both were in the top 10 I've ever seen as far as horrible losses.
More tomorrow from John and I live at the Golden Nugget in Atlantic City as we'll discuss the NFL coaching carousel, the NFL playoffs, plenty more on the NFL. That's all coming up tomorrow, 2 to 6, live at the Golden Nugget, where the parking is always free. Thanks, John.
Hey, thanks, Mike.